Good evening. First, how's the volume? Okay. Up. Better? Better? More? I've been instructed to keep talking. Is that better? Can everybody in the back hear me? Good? Okay, sweet. I'm Angela Metler. I'm an administrative assistant in the president's office at South Dakota Mines, and welcome to STEAM Cafe. Thank you so much to everybody that's here. There's a lot of new faces, and this is a great turnout, so I'm excited. STEAM Cafe is a collaboration with Hay Camp Brewing and South Dakota Public Broadcasting. We appreciate their support, and we appreciate your support as well. This is being live streamed on Zoom, so if we've got anybody on Zoom tonight, welcome to you as well. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A session with our presenter. So questions can be asked from the audience live. They can also be asked via the chat or the Q&A in the Zoom, and we will make sure that they are asked and answered live from there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Andy Farke.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll confess this is intimidating in a couple different ways. One, I set foot in Rapid City as a freshman at Mines in the fall of 1999, so it's been 25 years since I started my journey that I guess ultimately led me here to this point tonight. It's also a little intimidating to see some of my professors from undergrad. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a test right now. It's like I'm having my flashbacks to the note cards with the formulas for all the different minerals, memorizing the stratigraphic column for the Black Hills and applying that, and doing all that other stuff. But seriously, it's really great to be back here tonight in Rapid City. Just as a little bit about myself. First off, can everyone hear me okay back there? Great, awesome, all right. That's good, okay. So I'm a paleontologist. I'm originally from the town of Armour. Anyone here heard of Armour? Oh yeah, perfect, yep, a few of you have, good. Anyone here from Armour? Yeah, just one. Oh, there we go. Dad, you didn't raise your hand either, so you better. So we got 3 of us here. That's good. That's like a fifth of the population of the town here in this room tonight. No, it's 680 people now. So more seriously, I'm really glad to be back here. So I'm from Armour. I grew up there, and from a very young age, I have been fascinated by dinosaurs. Actually, I got my start as a paleontologist here in Rapid City at Dinosaur Park. So most of you probably know that. If you don't, you need to go check it out. It's a really awesome place. When I was 4 years old, we were on a family vacation to the Black Hills. And my parents took me up there, saw these things. They bought me a little packet of plastic dinosaurs in the gift shop there. And that was the moment that set me on the path to being a paleontologist. After that, I graduated with my bachelor's in geology from Mines in 2003, then went on to Stony Brook University with a little bit of a switch in trajectory. I hear Stony Brook there, yeah. And I did my PhD in anatomical sciences, so went from geology to like bloody squishy stuff. But in that anatomical sciences work, I went from learning about the rocks that the fossils are found in to learning about the bodies of these organisms, so understanding how the bones fit together, what the different bones did, and all of that. And since 2008, I've been a paleontologist at the Raymond Alf Museum of Paleontology out in Claremont, California, so about 30 miles to the east of Los Angeles. It's a really fun place to work. First off, we have easy access to outcrops and rocks and all that stuff. And our museum is also distinctive as the only nationally accredited paleontology museum that's located on a high school campus. So really my job is to corrupt the youth. I get to work with students between grades 9 through 12 in learning about geology, learning about paleontology, learning about how museums work, and also doing peer-reviewed research with them. So that's a really exciting place to be. So ultimately, that's a long way of saying that I'm a paleontologist. I'm also a home brewer. So I'm someone who likes to make beer. Are there any other home brewers in the audience tonight? Okay, a few of you, yeah. How many of you have medaled in the National Homebrew Competition? I know we got at least one. There we go. Randy Sauter, yeah. So it's a really awesome hobby. I will blame my dad for getting me started in that. I think he was homebrewing back before it was even legal. I know my family ultimately was homebrewing before it was legal. But the whole process of creating beer is a science in its own right. So really, as a home brewer, you're an amateur scientist who creates the raw liquid that you then hand over to the yeast that turn that raw liquid into beer. So I have my paleontology side and I have my home brewer side. And so in this presentation, over the next, 3.5 hours, we'll talk about how we can fit those two together. No, seriously, I'm just kidding. It's only gonna be 2 hours, so we're good here. You can buy lots of beers. All right, so my goals for this presentation are to teach you a little bit about brewing history, teach you a little bit about some of the fundamentals of brewing, and then also tie all of that together into the history of our planet, both the history of the rocks and the history of the life on that planet. Really, I think the main message here is nothing is constant, but it is all connected. So, why do we care about this? I think one, and I could give this, many of you could probably give this talk about whatever your field of study is, whether it's chemistry, whether it's engineering, whether it's marketing, whether it's communications, all of that somehow or another way will connect with beer and with brewing. Seriously, yeah, any of you could probably give this talk. But the reason I care about presenting on the paleontology and the geology side is I think it first gives us a better appreciation of the beer that many of us drink. And you could apply it to any other beverage too if you're not a beer person. Also, I think it really helps us to understand our place in our planet's history. We as humans are not just like something that kind of got plopped onto the surface at the end of the story. We're part of that whole story, and we're connected with all these processes that led to ultimately the best invention of humanity, beer. And I think the final thing is, for me, science is just cool. Science is cool. It is really, really fun to understand our world and the way that everything is connected together and the way that it all ticks. So that's really, really what my goals are for tonight and why we should care about this. Okay, so just so I know my audience a little better, raise your hand if you're a scientist of any sort. Okay, good. We got a few of you. Okay, how about if you're an engineer of any sort? Or a scientist and engineer? Yeah, okay, good. I like engineers too. Yeah, I got a few in my family. How about if you're a paleontologist specifically? Okay, yeah, we got a few of you. That's good, awesome. Or geologist, if you'd consider yourself more of a geologist, or maybe you're both, yeah. Batting for both teams, yep, there we go. And how about if you're a brewer or a home brewer? I know we had some of you earlier, great. Okay, good, so it looks like we got someone. If you're not any of those, it's okay, you're still welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit and you can carry on a better conversation. So I want to start off just talking about how I got involved with all of this. As I mentioned, I'm a paleontologist, I'm a home brewer, and I'm looking for any excuse to bring all of that stuff together. So it all starts in some ways, well, it really starts back in high school when I was helping my dad brew. Not that I ever enjoyed it back then, but that's where I really got my start as a home brewer. But I think the destiny of how I got started thinking about home brewing and beer and paleontology together involves my main research topic. And most of you hopefully will know this. If you're a South Dakota resident, you should know this animal. This is the state fossil for the state of South Dakota, an animal called Triceratops, my very favorite. It's one of those iconic dinosaurs that lived about 68 to around 66 million years ago. So at the very tail end of the Mesozoic era. A fascinating animal, and it's one that I've been working on since I was a high school student. Way back in the 1990s. I got my start even studying some specimens that were here in town at Mines. And I'm interested in Triceratops and all of its relatives. And Triceratops is part of a much larger group of animals called the ceratopsians, or horned dinosaurs. And kind of ironically, the earliest horned dinosaurs didn't even have horns. And understanding those animals is really important for understanding where Triceratops and all of that stuff came from. So about 10 years ago, a colleague of mine said, hey, we got this fossil. It's really cool. It's around maybe 106, 108 million years old. It was found in Wyoming. We think it might be the oldest horned dinosaur from North America. It's a really cool skull. Do you want to be a part of this? And so I'm like, yeah. It's a new species, really fun to work on. And so I ended up being the temporary custodian at my museum of this fossil here. So you can see here is there's the front of the animal over here. There's the back of the skull, part of a lower jaw. That's where the eyeball would be. That's where the nose would be. It's a little bit crushed, but it's a remarkably complete skull of an animal. And looking at this animal, it was very apparent that it was a species that had never before been seen by science. And so, as part of that, we got to study it. I worked with several colleagues from the Western University of Health Sciences, from the University of Oklahoma and the Sam Noble Museum, and other institutions. And we reconstructed this animal, compared it with a whole bunch of other stuff, and got to the point of figuring out, yeah, it's definitely a new species. And we started to put the flesh on the bone. So here's an artist reconstruction by artist Brian Eng of what this animal might have looked like. Here's another artist reconstruction to give you kind of the size of it. This is one of those animals that's probably fairly adorable, but it would make a really, really bad pet because it had an incredibly sharp beak. And the structure of that beak, the bones that it was made out of, the shape of those bones was part of what tied it to animals like Triceratops that came along later. So this is a horned dinosaur, but it didn't really have any horns on its head other than these weird little cheekbones. And so we published it in the year 2014, so geez, it's 10 years ago, in a peer-reviewed publication, and named it as a new animal, Aquilops americanus. It's like the most patriotic name ever. The name means American eagle face, referencing the big beak that it had on the front and the fact that it was the oldest horned dinosaur known from North America. So as a paleontologist, it's a really big milestone to publish a paper like this. First off, there's all the science that goes into it. We had this oldest horned dinosaur from North America. It tells us something about where Triceratops came from, this wonderful animal that everyone knows. And so when you reach a milestone like this, it's kind of fun to celebrate in some ways. So my colleague Matt Wadle went and got a tattoo of the animal. This is Matt's right arm with the tattoo of this animal. Matt's more into tattoos than I am. I'm not really a tattoo guy, but you know, once the right one comes along. But I am a home brewer. And so to celebrate this, I actually made a beer. This was one that I called Eagle Face Oatmeal Stout, you know, because home brewers, we love puns, we love bad names for our beer, love, you know, all that ridiculous stuff. And so I made a beer in honor of this animal, named after this animal. In fact, I went to like the next level beer geekery. It ended up published in Zymergy magazine, which is the magazine for the American Homebrewers Association. So that was really cool. They even published my recipe and all that. If any of you are homebrewers out there, you should find the recipe, you should make it. Tell me how you like it. It's named after a dinosaur. How cool is that? And then I went like to the next level of geekery, and my homebrew club, the Horse Thief Brewers Association out of San Dimas, California, served it at the North American Homebrewers Convention in San Diego back in, I think this was 2015. So this was like all the different layers of my brewing geekery and my paleontology geekiness coming together. And that connection between naming beers after fossils and after dinosaurs is nothing new. You see all sorts of breweries out there. There's probably dozens of beers out there on the market right now that have dinosaur names. In fact, if you go just next door, there's the Dinosaur, a great sour beer that has, if you see a couple of you have that in hand right now. Yeah, so dinosaurs and fossils are a really great marketing gimmick. But what I want to do in my remaining time here is show about how paleontology can go beyond inspiration for really clever beer names, and it can get into the realm of investigating all those connections, those genuine connections between beer and between our sciences. All right, so That's me. There we go. So we've gotten through the prelude of the talk. I love thinking about fossils. I love drinking about fossils. And now we're going to find out some ways to bring the two of those together. Now, if you listen to or read any history of brewing, it typically begins a couple thousand years ago. And that connection of it talks about, okay, so somewhere in the Middle East, people figured out how to make beer. You can read about it in these cuneiform tablets. And then in the Middle Ages, they went from things without hops to things with hops. And then ultimately, we have the most highly evolved form of beer that's made by me. And that's the cultural history that you get. And that's important, and there's a lot of really great information out there. There's a lot of great research going on about the human cultural development of beer. But I think it is just as important, I think it's just as interesting to think about what's the bigger picture. Where does our beer fit into not just human history, but the history of our entire planet, all 4.6 billion years of our planet's history. And so that's where we're going to go tonight. You know, if you miss out on that history, you're missing out on most of the story of beer. So we're going to give you a little bit of geological time orientation. I know for the geologists and the paleontologists in the room, you've done this before a million times. You could probably recite the geological time scale in your sleep. But I know we have some other folks here. We have like engineers. You never think about geological time probably, although you're all wonderful people. So we want to give you just a little bit of orientation. So we know our planet, and this is based on multiple lines of evidence, is around 4.6 billion years old. And we're going to go kind of around this clock dial here. So we are right about there. And so think about your arm as a timeline. So going from your armpit to the end of your finger, we got 4.6 billion years of history. Most of the history of our planet, at least for paleontologists, not much is happening. You know, it's a lot of like little squishy things. There's all the molten rock surface. There's the formation of oceans, some unicellular life. And if we think about this arm timeline here, dinosaurs don't actually show up till about here, that first knuckle on your middle finger. And then hops show up at the second knuckle. Hops, those things that make those great flavors in beers. And then humans and all of our brewing history shows up just at the very, very end of your fingernail. So there's your little bit of geological time perspective. We're going to spend most of it in kind of like this last, basically in the finger region out here. Okay, so let's talk about that. So there's four basic ingredients that we're going to touch on. Some of them are going to get a little more time than others. It's four basic ingredients that go into beer. The biggest one is water. All jokes aside about like Coors Light or Bud Light, like most of any beer is water, no matter what the beer is. We have barley, usually, and there's some other grains that go into that also. We have hops, which will give us our nice bitterness. And then we have the yeast that ties all of that together, and that's what creates the alcoholic kick that goes into our beer. So we're going to talk about all four of those tonight, and we're going to talk about their connection to geology and paleontology. So I'm going to start off with water. So water is something that is really the key ingredient of beer. For me as a home brewer, it was like the last one I really thought about, but in some ways it turns out to be one of the most important. And historically, our water, wherever your water comes from, your groundwater locally, is going to be something that has a major impact on the kinds of beers that are brewed locally. And if you get into the brewing literature, you read about all the different water tables and water minerals that are in different areas and how that impacted the kinds of beers that were brewed there. And so for the purposes of an example that I want to talk about here is one particular example in the UK at a place called Burton-upon-Trent. This is a really famous brewing area, particularly well known in the 18th and the 19th centuries for their beer. Brewery you might have heard of that started there was the Bass Brewery. You can get their beer, their beers at a lot of different stores that do imports and that stuff. And it's in the Midlands of England, so it's roughly smack in the middle of the country. Very picturesque sort of town. And historically, it was most influential for its pale ales, especially IPA, so the India Pale Ales. And I'm just going to do a little bit of historical side note here. If you start reading like just kind of the most widely available stuff about IPAs, you'll see all these things about how IPA was invented there. It wasn't invented here. a lot of what you've maybe read about the history of IPAs, about like how it was made to like be shipped to India and all this stuff specifically for that. Most of that's not true. There's some really good histories that sort of delve into that. But I think even though things like pale ales and IPAs were developed elsewhere in England, they really were perfected in this area of Burton-upon-Trent. And that was because early 19th century brewers discovered that their water, the water that they had that they brought up in their wells out of the ground going into the brew houses, was really great for making hoppy beers. And so something about that water accentuated the hoppiness. Something about the water helped that beer to drop clear, so that rather than having this murky, hazy stuff, you would get something that would be a really nice, clear product. And so it's safe to say, there's a lot of historical sources that reference this, that the water in this area of England was the secret to the success of the breweries there. And along with the improvements in shipping technologies and the industrialization of the brewing process, it really helped turn this place into the powerhouse that it still is to this day. So even if this area didn't invent IPAs and pale ales, it is safe to say that they did perfect them. So what does this have to do with dinosaurs? What does this have to do with paleontology? So we're going to rewind the clock back to the late part of the Paleozoic, early part of the Mesozoic. And think about the fact that there's, all through geological history, there's rocks that are being deposited there. And the kinds of rocks that your well water is coming from is going to have an influence on the minerals that are in this water. So if you're pulling your water source from a limestone, you might get a lot of calcium carbonate that's dissolved in that, and that can really wreak havoc with your pipes. In California, where we're at, we have a lot of those carbonates in our water. If you're getting your water from maybe a mainly granite source, you might get a pretty clean water without a lot of minerals in it. There's a lot of complexities to that. I'm going to apologize to my former professors for glossing over the whole semester or two of my groundwater class. But basically, you know, the kind of the water is where it comes from. So I could give a whole talk about that. Any of my former professors could probably give a better talk about any of that. But I'm going to just focus on this one particular area. So Burton water comes from their groundwater. Historically, much of that water came from their groundwater. And it pulls, at least in part, historically, and groundwater sources change over time, from around a 220 million year old rock in the Branscombe Mudstone Formation. And there's a lot of literature on this. If you're a geologist, you can delve into that. It's a really complicated area. The names on the different rock units change a lot. We're just going to say basically the main important point is that the water historically came out of these Triassic aged rocks, so the early part of the age of dinosaurs. And at that point, when these rocks were formed, when they were laid down, we had essentially one continent, Pangaea. And there it is, right in the middle of Pangaea. We're sort of, you know, over here about somewhere over there. And when you get this big continent kind of all, you know, mushed together, in the interiors of the continent, once you get away from the ocean, you end up with basically this really dry, arid environment. And so we have this thing here, it's called a rain shadow effect. And in these arid conditions, you get these unusual rock types. You get conditions that are very similar to what we have in parts of Southern California now, like in Death Valley and that, an environment called playas. Looks something like this. This is, I think, the Death Valley area. So you get these like interior basins. You get the water that kind of, and all the ground, all the rains that wash stuff in. And you get these concentrations of mineral deposits. Basically that form in these ephemeral, these seasonal lakes. You get your rainy season, the lakes fill up, all the minerals sort of dissolve, then they get redeposited in there. And so when the lakes dry out, you get all of these minerals that are left behind in the rocks. And one of the, along with all of that, you have these dinosaurs walking around, animals like Coelophysis, kind of these early dinosaurs. You find their footprints in that area there also, where these IPA rocks are coming from. And so, and then here's a modern example. This is my son when he was about 3 or 4 years old at the Salton Sea in Southern California, which is basically like an analogous inland lake. We have really, really nasty, highly mineralized water because there's no outlets or inlets to it. And this is very similar to the kinds of rocks that are forming around 220 million years ago in that part of what's now England. And within those rocks, one of the main minerals is this thing called gypsum. There's my hand with a handful of gypsum. If you're a brewer that's done IPAs, maybe you've added this stuff to your water. But the main point is this gypsum forms in arid areas. And when we had 220 million years ago, these arid regions in that part of what's now England, you get these minerals concentrated. Fast forward 220 million years later, people are starting to dig wells into this, and they're pulling up all this prehistoric minerals, all these prehistoric salts that, like when the dinosaurs were running around on the landscape, were getting dissolved into that. For just a rapid city connection, if you've seen like those red rocks around with those little white bands, the Spearfish Formation, it's kind of the same sort of environment. It may be just a little bit earlier, but very, very similar kind of stuff. So ultimately, we have an event in Earth's history where you have this arid lake bed with early dinosaurs running around on it, and then millions of years later, humans pulling groundwater out of that, and that is what, in some ways, led to the perfection of the IPA, probably one of the most commercially successful styles right now in craft breweries. So that's our first story. So going from our groundwater, from our rocks being deposited into that. Okay, next, so we've touched water. We're a fourth of the way there. We're actually going to move pretty fast through this one. And that's barley. So barley's grown here in South Dakota, grown in a lot of other areas. And barley malt is made by sprouting your grain. You get the starches in those little grains to get converted into sugars, and then you halt that with heat. So barley is a type of grass. For me as a paleontologist, thinking about the dinosaur in my beer, grasses really don't register. There's maybe some fossil evidence back in the Mesozoic that grasses were fairly rare, but there's not a ton of them. Most of what we think of as our grasses today evolved well after the time of the dinosaurs, so early horses and all of that. And I think it's extra important to note that the barley that we see in our beer is really a human invention. It's part of the domestication of some of these grasses to be better for human purposes, like brewing. So then, got to ask, well, what's the connection between barley and paleontology? And I guess I got to talk now about the beer that I'm drinking. This is the Pilsner, the Czech-style Pilsner from next door. I see at least one person, enjoying that there. This is one of my very favorite styles of beer to make. It's a challenging beer to make. Probably a commercial example some of you might be familiar with is Pilsner Urquell. Yep, it's a really great, kind of the classic example of this style. As I got more serious about homebrewing, I decided that I wanted to try and perfect that style. Pilsners are really challenging to make because unlike some other beer styles, there's not a lot to cover up your brewing sins. So if you you do something a little off, if you don't quite control your temperature right, if you get an infection, you can't cover it up with hops or other malts. It's like a pretty clean beer in some ways. And so I was spending a lot of time trying to recreate or create an authentic Pilsner. So just as a little history on this, so our Czech Pilsner, the original Pilsner, originated in Pilsen, which is now the Czech Republic, in the year 1842, which totally by coincidence was the first year that the word dinosaur was coined by paleontologists. So that's a really important year for me as a paleontologist, because Pilsners were created and dinosaurs were created. Okay, so this is a very pale style. It's very hoppy because of all the hops they dump into it. It's also important to note, just tying back last, that it relies on a very low mineral water, and that's that water source. That geology is, again, having that influence on the kinds of beers that are brewed there. And then I was researching, how to make the best Bohemian or Czech-style Pilsner, doing all this reading online, late at night or whatever. And I ran across this on a malt company's website. That's the Weyermann Malt Company. And they said, and I'll read this here, the most influencing process for the production of original Bohemian malt is the floor malting process after a 48-hour steeping. This is done on traditional naturally cooled Solnhofen limestone floor tiles. Now, if you're not a paleontologist, that last sentence will mean nothing to you. But if you are a paleontologist, when you see the word Solnhofen limestone, that's where my paleontology and beer geek alarms started going off. And so now I want to convince the rest of you about why that is really cool, and why I was so excited about that as a paleontologist. And to understand that, we got to turn back into the history of barley malt and barley malting. And historically, now today there's industrial processes and all this that we create our malt from the raw barley grains. But historically, it was done through a process called floor malting, as they talk about this right here. And you got to malt it on a floor of some sort. This is a picture of one of those malt houses over in the old world. You can see the barley there, and you can see some of the floor. And it turns out that the floor is not made out of manufactured tiles or metal or anything like that. It's made out of rock. And then we think about, as you saw in that last slide, where our rock came from. It came from a very specific part of Bavaria in Germany called Solnhofen. And this has been used traditionally. As I did more research, I found that it was used in many traditional European malt houses, including those that are still in today's Czech Republic. Again, where that first Pilsner beer was created in 1842. So the favored floor material that they used, and you can see some of these tiles as they're coming out of the quarry, has always been tiles that were quarried in the Bavarian village of Solnhofen. And the reason for this is that they cleave really nicely. You get things that are very thin, relatively lightweight. They're very hard. If you've ever scratched a bit of Solnhofen limestone, it's very durable kinds of stuff. It has good thermal properties in terms of either retaining or not absorbing heat. It's got good moisture retention. It's got good wear resistance. It has all the things for a good natural building material. And then so of course the question is, what does this have to do with anything? Here's some pictures of these mines. I'd say, great, oh look, they're making rocks into tile floors. Here's some pictures of some of the historic process. It's been used for a lot of things also. It's been used for lithographic plates and some of the traditional printing processes. But as a paleontologist, I was less excited about that and more excited about the fact that these Solnhofen limestones date back to around 150 million years ago, to the Jurassic, when this part of Europe was basically a whole series of islands, archipelagos, lagoons, very tropical, maybe a very pleasant place to go snorkeling. And because of the way these were formed in these very gentle environments where fossils are getting deposited, maybe low oxygen so that they get preserved well, we get some spectacular fossils. In fact, some of them are on display at the Museum of Geology. Here they are. So they were basically things that came up as bycatch when people are doing these industrial operations to get these malt house tiles. So you get things like dragonflies, things like fossil shrimp, things that looks like they'd be really good to eat if they weren't 150 million years past their expiration date. We get flying reptiles called pterosaurs. Animals like this, kind of the original air monsters, kind of prehistoric dragons. And then, as a paleontologist and as a dinosaur person, the other thing that came from these limestone quarrying processes was this animal right here. Who knows this animal? Who's seen this one? A few of you? Yeah. All right, few hands. So this is an animal called Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is probably, especially for paleontologists, one of the most iconic animals in the history of paleontology for really two reasons. First, we know it's the oldest bird. And it shows a lot of things why it's birds. If you were to look closely at the fossil, you'd see it has feathers. It has a wishbone, just like birds do, if you look in there. It has some other bird-like features in the skull and elsewhere. But it also preserves some very dinosaur-like features. So it has a long, bony tail, which most of your chickens that you eat probably don't have long, bony tails. They shouldn't. The skull, if you look at the skull, it has teeth in that skull. It has claws on the end of its wings, more claws than you get in your typical chicken. So you get these teeth, long bony tail, these feathers, all these things together in something that has feathers and is obviously a bird. And this was really important as one of the first links right after Darwin's theory of evolution came out, demonstrating something that he predicted called a transitional fossil. So a fossil basically showing features of the ancestral group as well as the descendants. So this is a really iconic fossil. It was very important for understanding the theory of evolution, and also really important for a specific demonstration of how birds evolved. There's a reconstruction of what it looked like, probably kind of crow-like. It's a really, really neat animal. And so what I like to think, and I don't know this for certain, but I at least tell myself this story, is that and we know that as these malt house tiles were being quarried, some of them had defects on them, those defects being fossils, and then those fossils that were discovered, they've actually changed our understanding of the world. And so we go from commercial barley malting to the collection and the study of fossils, and then iconic animals like Archaeopteryx that really change what we know about the world. Okay, so I tracked down all that information, and then as a paleontology geek, I'm like, so could I brew a beer that's made on like Archaeopteryx limestone? And so I did the research, and I found that you can actually get this Bohemian Pilsner malt through Vyraman Malting Company. It's a floor malted malt. I wrote to the company. They said, yes, it's made on Solnhofen limestone tiles. I'm like, okay, this is a good score. I got some hops from my dad. He grows some on his farm in South Dakota. And then I was able to basically create this Archaeopteryx themed beer after doing all this study in that. So that was a lot of fun. So really the main point of this is, even though barley as a grain doesn't go back into the era of dinosaurs in any direct way, the development of commercial malting led to some really amazing paleontological discoveries that have really changed our understanding of our planet's history. All right, so we've gone through water, we've gone through barley malt, and now we're going to really quickly go through these things called yeast. And yeast are, basically they're the little beasties that ferment stuff. So as a brewer, I make my wort that's got the barley juice, it's got the hop stuff in it, and then I give it to the yeast, and the yeast are going to basically bring it all together. Unfortunately, yeast are small, they're squishy, they don't have any hard parts, they have a really crummy fossil record. So there's not much that I can really say about it. So the good news here is this is going to be like the shortest part of the talk. So we do have to rely on genetics, on gene squeezing to figure out some of this. And there's techniques that can be used to figure out some of that fossil record. They're a mess though. Yeast are like, for a geneticist, in talking with some of my, the folks I know that deal with that stuff, like they're awful because they like interbreed, they swap genomes, all this really, they're horrible to even study with genetics. There's possible yeast microfossils that go back to about 1 billion years. When you go back 1 billion years and you're talking about like little oval things, like who knows what it actually is. So it's really hard to tell, really where that starts. Genetics, and again, there's always caution about this, suggests that the type of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that we use for brewing might have diverged from its closest relatives around 420 to 350 million years ago, but when true brewing yeast appeared is uncertain. So maybe somewhere like back in here, we don't know. There's some potential yeast fossils that have been found in amber. The most oldest definitive yeast fossil that we know from the fossil record is around 100 million years old. And there have been, if you start to go into the brewing literature, there's alleged 40-million-year-old yeast that was revived from amber, so sort of think like Jurassic Park style. That's very controversial. I don't know that most people are convinced, but that is a story out there. So really all there is to say is, we don't know much about yeast and any of that. So we're gonna skip that part and now move on to my last little chunk I wanna talk about here, which are hops. Hops are amazing. If you're an IPA fan, they're like, really what you think about. They're the bittering agents that we have in most beers. They're important for aroma. Today we have several species that exist. They're found across much of the northern hemisphere, so Europe, Asia, North America. But the regular use for humans has been really since the Middle Ages. Our hops are only one twig, though, on the family tree of life, on our plant family tree. And to figure out this family tree, which is where we're going to go here now, there's a couple lines of evidence. So we can use the anatomy. Things that are closely related look similar. You can use the DNA. So if you do a DNA test on a plant, things that are more closely related will have more similar DNA. And we see something similar in fossils, too. So fossils that look more similar to each other are probably more closely related. So all life shares a common ancestor if you go back far enough. And so we can talk about that. Hops are a plant called Humulus lupulus. They're part of a group called angiosperms. They're flowering plants. This is not a hop plant. This is actually a paintbrush flower out in the Mojave Desert, a photo I took during one of our super blooms. And if we trace back the oldest record of flowering plants, which is the big group that hops belong to, it goes back definitively maybe around 125 million years. There might be some slightly older fossils that have been a little bit controversial. But the oldest ones look something like this. You probably wouldn't recognize them as a flowering plant. Here's a life restoration of what they might have looked like. As we go back through this, we can use different lines of evidence to figure out some of the relatives of our hops. And so here's actually the closest relative of hops that's still around today. Some of you might none of you recognize this, of course. But it's the main point is this plant, which some of you may have heard of, called cannabis or marijuana or whatever you want to call it, is the closest genetic relative to the brewing hops that are used today. And they share the seed structure. They share, I've heard, similar flowers. I've heard the pollen is very similar, also told by expert sources. So they share a lot of these different anatomical features that tie them together into part of a bigger group that's called, oddly enough, Cannabaceae. That's the name of the big plant supergroup that hops and this plant belong to. There's another plant that's part of that, thing called a hackberry, right here. For those of you that have done work in the White River Badlands, you can find seeds of these things. They're also part of that Cannabaceae family and sort of like next, more distant cousins to hops. And so we know from all of this, from DNA, from fossil evidence, that our hops that we're using legally in our beer today probably diverged from that other plant maybe around like 85 or 90 million years ago. So now I want to think about, okay, we know these hops that we have. These are some my dad grew out East River. We know from the fossil record, actually oddly enough, they showed up right before the end of the age of dinosaurs. And to find these fossil hops, the oldest fossil hops, you want to go up north, basically straight north from here, up into the Hell Creek Badlands of North Dakota. And scientists from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science have done an extensive collection of fossil plants from this time, along with all those other things that happened to live at the time. Animals like Triceratops, remember me talking about that a little bit ago, our state fossil here. That animal, T-Rex, not my favorite animal, but there it is. I got to mention it in a paleo talk. So we have all these animals there. And then, along with that, as paleobotanists, scientists who study these fossil plants, start to look at all the things that are living on the landscape alongside Triceratops and that big carnivore, whose name I shall not say, we have this thing here that, as they started to study it, turned out to look a lot like a leaf from a modern hop. And so this plant here, which is in the collections at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, is around 67 million years old, and it is thought to be the oldest example of a hop in the fossil record. They don't know that it's Humulus, which is the modern genus, but it's probably something very close to it. Based on what they know from the environment, is that it lived in near rivers in open patches, so areas where you get a lot of disturbance, as the river channel floods and covers over stuff, and then plants grow back. These plants, if you grow hops, are there any hop growers here? Yeah, like you probably know, when hops take off, they take off. They grow fast. And that's a characteristic that was probably shared by these ancestral hops. And so what some of my paleobotanist friends have suggested that, the fact that you have all these dinosaurs running around in the landscape, like munching things constantly, and you try to grow as a plant, and then you suddenly get, bitten off at the head. Evolutionarily, it's a really, there's a lot of pressure to want to grow quickly. And so there, at least my thought is that the fact that we had dinosaurs wandering around eating these early hops, like as a hop plant, it's really good to start to grow pretty quickly. We don't know this for sure, but I like to think that dinosaurs were at least partially responsible for these hops. My next question that I often get then is, well, if we have these hops, could we brew with them? Unfortunately, probably not. The oldest hop cones in the fossil record don't show up till much later. We know that the wild hops that are cousins of our domesticated hops, like they're not actually that great for brewing. So we probably couldn't brew with these dinosaur hops. But what is important about all of this is that it shows that hops probably originated in North America. It's a North American invention, I guess we can say. There's a lot that we can understand from that. So I actually, a couple of years ago, I brewed a amber ale made with hops that were growing, not the fossil hops, but ones growing out of the rocks that the fossil hops were found in. That was kind of fun. And then as I looked into it and learned that, okay, after we have our fossils 66 million years ago, our next youngest hops are around 35 million years old at fluorescent fossil beds. And then we have hops seeds that are around 10 million years old in Siberia. And then European hops show up around 3 million years ago in Germany. So the thought is, for our modern brewing hops, and here's a nice timeline of that, is, there's our oldest, probably hops there. There's that other plant I didn't talk about. Our oldest fossil hop around 67 million years ago. Hops in Colorado around 35 million years ago. And it's thought that kind of when we have things like mastodons and that rolling around is when we get our modern brewing hops that pick up. All right, so the hop fossil record, unfortunately, is not that great. And so to fill in some of the details, we have to turn to fossil pollen. Pollen on hops is very distinctive. It can be recognized by paleontologists. And then what they have found is that the history of hops was also intertwined with that history of the Ice Age, that last little bit of Earth's history. And so there are pollen records from a database called Neotoma, and there's some other databases out there that basically, as people start to sample lake cores and other sorts of cores, they find fossil pollen at all sorts of different ages. So here we have an example from kind of like later part of the Ice Age. And then here we go a little bit later, and you see the pollen here. So the main thing to note is that we had ice sheets over a good chunk of northern North America. If you're from East River, you're in ice sheet country. And where you have ice sheets, how many hops do you think are going to grow there? Yeah, it's not a great hop place. And so as a result, when we have these big glaciers covering much of northern North America, all the hops that might have been up and down through the continent basically get sent all south. That's the only place they can live. And so as a result, when we look at the genetics of hops today, the most of the genetic diversity that's found in hops is in this hop species called Humulus neomexicanus, which is particularly well known in the southwestern US. And that's a result, basically, of the fact that when you have all these ice sheets here, hops don't have many places to grow. And so the oldest species, the ones that have been around for the longest time, are the ones that are going to be in the southwestern US. And they've just recently, like in the last 10, 20 years, have started to be incorporated into commercial hop operations. If you're a brewer or a home brewer, you've probably heard about Neomexicanus hops, varieties like Sabro and others that have become kind of the latest hops. And so they're bringing in from these native North American hops, sometimes crossing them with European hops, the more traditional hops, to get a lot of interesting flavors and aromas. And then that's particularly important because the hops that we have in North America, they have a deep history. They have a lot of genetic diversity that's maybe not seen in some of the long-bred European hops. And so I would like to think as a home brewer, this geological history that means we have this long time of hops in this part of North America, sort of like our piggy bank of hop varieties. Maybe things that are resistant to particular kinds of pests or resistant to different kinds of diseases that might ultimately be the key to, if there's ever a particular hop blight or something, really being useful for the brewing industry down the road. And that's been found in many cases. Some of these native North American hops do have resistance to particular diseases that European hops don't. And so as, for instance, as we've seen in the wine industry back in the 19th century, where the North American grapes really were what saved wine in the world, I think ultimately we may find that the North American hops, which have weathered ice ages and all that stuff, might be the key to really ensuring the future of hops and of beer long into the future. And so now we've gone through a good chunk of geological time. We've spent most of our time, of course, in these last 250 million years or so. Hopefully, you've been convinced that sciences like geology and paleontology are useful and interesting for understanding the beer that we drink. We know that the water that is used to make beer, has to be tied to the rocks that it comes from. So that'll influence the development of beer styles, like IPA, which we have because 200 some million years ago, there was a lot of gypsum being deposited in parts of what's now the UK. Our barley, it does have a little bit of a fossil record, but really the most important thing is the malt process. The process for malting directly depended in Europe on some of these rocks that were deposited during the age of dinosaurs. And we got some really cool fossils that have changed our view of paleontology. Yeast, we don't talk about yeast. That's pretty boring. Not a good fossil record, but just know it's there. And then, as we saw, our hops have not just a really interesting fossil record from the time of dinosaurs, but they have this interesting interaction during the Ice Age of things that were under ice sheets and maybe refuges of hops in parts of the US that are now being incorporated into some of the best craft beers that are out there. So I really want to leave you with the fact that beer is not just a cultural phenomenon, although it is a cultural phenomenon, it does have a human history, but it's also a scientific phenomenon and it's a geological phenomenon. And I think as a brewer, as a home brewer, I've understood how beer ties me to human traditions and to family members and friends, geologists having a beer after a good day in the field. But I've also, I think, really been inspired to think about how this beer that I'm drinking connects not just with me and not just with other humans, but with the whole history of our planet. So I'll leave you there with that. Cheers to geology and paleontology. All right, and I have been told that if any of you want to stick around, I have a moment or two for questions. If there's any questions, I will not take it from any geology professors. My answers were all correct. You can ask non-geology questions. Yeah.
I was going to say that we taught you everything we knew about geology at the time, but we didn't know you could have taught us a lot about beer.
I didn't know that then. I was not of legal drinking age, of course, when you were, I did not know what beer was at that point. Of course not. Yeah. Any other? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was patterns geographically relative to the diversity of hops. I'm not an expert on that, but my understanding is that stuff in the Southwest really has a lot of the genetic diversity for hops. And again, that relates to the fact that elsewhere in North America, the North American hops, they just couldn't exist. And so they've got this deep, deep history in that part of the world. Oh, yeah, question.
How does water that is within gypsum, how does that affect the flavor?
Oh, good, yeah. So how does water that's going through this gypsum stuff affect the flavor? So I want to just back up and give a kind of the general disclaimer that today most breweries do water treatments, so you're not as limited by what your local water is. My water in the LA area is not great, so I end up using a lot of like reverse osmosis water to kind of get a blank slate. But things like gypsum, they can accentuate hoppiness. So they'll give it maybe a more crisp flavor. So like with a really hoppy beer, having some gypsum can help to kind of bring that hoppiness to the forefront. If you have too much though, it'll give it kind of a minerally flavor that in some styles may not be very pleasant. Yeah.
Do you know the chemistry at all?
Oh, do I know the chemistry? I was not a chemistry major, so yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. That's the next talk by some chemistry guy they're bringing, yeah. Yeah, there is a whole discussion on that, yeah. That's outside my wheelhouse though. Good question though. Yeah?
How was that Pilsner made?
How was the Pilsner I made? It was my first attempt, so it wasn't the best attempt, but I perfected it over a couple times, and it actually ended up pretty good. Yeah. For those of you that are homebrewers, I'm sure many of you know this, but like what I found the key was, good clean conditions for my brewing equipment, and also just like good temperature control. Because if you kick a yeast at too high of a temperature, it'll throw off some off flavors. And again, you can't cover up those sins of brewing, with something that's as light as a Pilsner. Yeah, but it turned out pretty good. It was a lot of fun too. Yeah. I geeked out on that beer. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Randy.
I just had a great hay camp dinosaur here.
Yes.
And what dinosaurs could I expect in this?
Yeah. Yes, that is a good question. So the dinosaur, the one that they serve here, the dinosaur that you'll see on the logo is a sauropod, which is the long-necked dinosaurs. Think like Brontosaurus and those things. Regrettably, many of them were extinct by the time. They were not living in the areas where we find our fossil hops. So I guess it's a little bit of a lie that that's the logo for it. Should be a Triceratops. Yeah, you wouldn't. I guess you probably wouldn't find. I don't know what aquifer. They're getting the water out of here for the beer. So that's the next edition of this talk. Yeah, yeah.
The university has branded a beer called Hard Rock Ale Blonde Ale.
Yes.
If you got to pick the next beer, what flavor would you make it? What dinosaur would you name it after?
Oh, that's a good question. I will have to think on that. I feel like I'm really put on the spot here now by someone higher up the food chain than me. That is a good question. So I'm always partial to Pilsners and stuff like that. But I think an IPA, everyone loves IPAs. And I think the story that hops share with dinosaurs and with our planet's history and with things like the spearfish formation locally, with all that gypsum development that's happening at roughly the same time as the gypsum development in the UK. I think an IPA probably, I know some people out there hate IPAs, like, oh, another craft beer IPA. But I think if I were to choose the beer that best epitomizes geology and paleontology together, fortunately or unfortunately, it's going to be an IPA. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay. Oh, wait, one more there. Yeah.
The precursor to the Triceratops you mentioned earlier, was it an adult, and what were the criteria used to define its age?
Oh, good question. Was it an adult, and what were the criteria? So talking about Aquilops, that animal way at the beginning of the talk, it was probably a young animal, and that's based on the fact of the texture of the skull. Some of the cranial bones the bones in the skull were not totally knit together or fused up like you see in adult animals. However, we were still confident that we could distinguish it as its own animal because it had some features in the skull that we know from other dinosaurs don't change as they get older. If I were to guess, that animal is maybe half grown to 2/3 grown. Yep. Excellent question. All right. Well, with that, I'll be around here for a little bit afterwards. If anyone else has questions, they were too shy to shout out at me. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight.
So we do Steam Cafe every third Tuesday. So next month, that will be August 20th. And we're going to chill out a little bit. So the title is An Introduction to Meditation, Mindfulness, and Introspection. It's going to be presented by Dr. Jonathan Gibson, who is an associate professor in our Department of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. So we hope to see you next month.